After the song is finished, John notices that the temple stands open. Now, he uses a rather interesting phrase. The temple of the tent, or the tabernacle, of witness in heaven. Now, the tabernacle and the temple were two different structures. Right? The tabernacle created in the wilderness, and then the temple built by Solomon. But they're kind of conflated here. It is both kind of the tabernacle and the temple. But the temple here stands open. And we've talked about this before. There have been other passages where the temple is open. We talked about the veil being torn at Jesus' death, the access into the heavenly temple that the Hebrews writer talks about. Right? And so this idea of the temple standing open, the access to God is not restricted only to a certain few. It's available to anyone who will come through Jesus. But now it's not so much about what's going into the temple as what's coming out. Out of the temple come the seven angels. Are these the same seven angels that had the seven trumpets? Probably not. Ultimately, it doesn't matter for the storyline of Revelation. There's no indication given one way or the other. But it seems like this is a separate set of seven whose task is specifically related to what they are getting ready to do, which is related to these seven plagues. And so now we see the great and marvelous sign that John talked about back in verse 1. Now, a passage from the Old Testament that may be behind this is Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 21. In that passage, God essentially sets before the Israelites punishments that will come if they refuse to obey. Right? And all the things that will take place. And in verse 21, he says, if you continue hostile to me and will not obey me, I will continue to plague you sevenfold for your sins. Now, the Hebrew is, I will plague you kind of 7 times. The Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, says, I will bring on you 7 plagues. Right? And John is heavily dependent upon the Septuagint. So this idea of the 7 plagues might be drawn here from Leviticus. Now, not so much specifically at God's people as at the beast, the followers of the beast. But here are the 7 plagues, complete. Right? Perfect judgment that God is bringing out. Now, the angels, these 7 angels, are robed in pure bright linen with golden sashes across their chest. When you read that, what does it make you think of? The Son of Man, in chapter 1, was described as wearing white clothing and having golden sash. So there's that connection. There's also the connection, similar dress with the 24 elders. But we might also think of them as kind of dressed as priests. Right? The priests were to wear linen garments when they ministered in the temple. And in this case, they are serving God, just like the priests do. And so out they come. Now they are carrying the 7 plagues in their hands. I almost think of like canisters, right? They're carrying these containers that have the 7 plagues. But then they are given 7 bowls with the wrath of God that they're going to mix these plagues with. And so they're carrying the plagues. They are given bowls with the wrath of God. Now, these are golden bowls. And the prayers of the saints in chapter 5, verse 8 the incense was present in golden bowls. Are these distinct? Maybe. Maybe we can think of it as kind of in response to the prayers that had been offered, God put wrath into these bowls that are not going to be mixed with the plagues. But it might not be. It might just be, golden bowls were a part of the utensils of the temple, and so that's why we see golden bowls. And so the angels are given 7 bowls to put the plagues in, mixing it with the wrath of God. Now, probably, given the description of the bowls, it's more like a saucer than a deep bowl. A saucer that is meant to be dumped very quickly, right? So the contents are going to come out very rapidly versus a bowl where you kind of think of the liquid kind of coming out over a time. The saucer is going to be turned over and the wrath is going to come out very quickly. And so we see another expression here of the wrath of God. Saw it previously as a cup to be drank, but now it's in bowls that are going to be poured out. Once the angels had exited the temple is filled with smoke. Now, in thinking about the temple filling with smoke, what would this symbolize? Can you think of anything from the Old Testament that might be connected here? Okay, Mount Sinai, the smoke that kind of covered Mount Sinai, that might be part of it.
In Isaiah, when he sees into the temple, and the seraphim are singing, and I think it says that there was smoke coming out of the temple.
Yeah, so there's an altar burning coals in the temple in Isaiah 6. Also in the tabernacle, when the tabernacle would be set up in the Israelite camp, when the Israelites were to stay there, the pillar of cloud would rest over the tabernacle until it was time to move. But there were several times in the Old Testament when that cloud, that smoke, filled the tabernacle. And when it's first kind of set up, God's smoke. And so what's suggested here is God's full presence. Right? So the smoke filling the temple is God fully inhabiting the temple like he did in the tabernacle in the Old Testament. So much so that no one is able to enter the temple. Right? And so the smoke's coming from the glory of God and from his power. And the smoke is such that no one can enter the temple until the plagues were ended. So we have here the fullness of God, meaning that God is fully present with these acts. His glory, his power, his holiness, his wrath, it's all there in this temple. And because of that, it's almost as if God's presence is crowding anything else out. There's no way for anything else to enter that temple. What questions or comments at this point? Moving on into chapter 16, John now hears a voice, a loud voice, coming from the temple. Whose voice is this? Doesn't specifically say, but take an educated guess. You say God, why? Yeah, no one can enter the temple, so the only thing in the temple is God, right? So it has to be God's voice. And so God's voice booms out of the temple, out of the smoke, and calls forth to the 7 angels to go and pour out his wrath on the earth. Perhaps here kind of images of the drink offering that would often be a part of the sacrifices, right? Some sort of liquid being poured on the altar and offered to God. But here in all of this, we have the similarities to God's plagues on Egypt. And many of them are reflective of that. Now, there's a couple that aren't. There's a couple that are kind of unique to Revelation here. But in each case, an angel is pouring out his bowl of wrath on various elements and places. The first angel pours out his bowl on earth. And upon pouring his bowl out on earth, what takes place? What's the plague? The first angel's plague. All right, there's a sword that people get. Specifically identified as those who had the mark of the beast, those who had worshipped the beast's image. Now certainly here it says it's poured out on earth, but the target is the people, not the land. And so on earth means the people. Very much like the sixth plague of Egypt, boils. And then we can also think of Job, and then Job in chapter 2, this kind of sores that Job suffered. These are abscessed or ulcerous sores. It's like there's an infection here. But it's so widespread because it's targeted the many people that have taken the mark of the beast. And one would think that, it's to the point where it's impossible to treat all these people because just like in Egypt, the healers have the same plague that everybody else does. Now, how would you like to go into your doctor's office and say, what's your condition? I have a foul and painful sore. So there's really, it's not how we describe it, but this idea of, it's festering, it's infected, it smells. And this is the terrible disease. Does this mean that God was going to specifically put foul and painful sores on people, or will at some point? No. Again, all of these judgments we should understand as symbolic. So, what might this symbolize? Maybe just in general, the physical consequences that sometimes befall people who reject God. That sometimes people turn their back on God, and that's worked out physically. And they end up with physical illnesses. Certainly people that do drugs, people that would abuse alcohol, often end up with physical consequences of their sins. And so perhaps that's what is suggested here. These people have put themselves in opposition to God, and so they physically have suffered for that. The second angel pours out his bowl. And again, it's almost as if like they're one right after another as opposed to the time frame that it takes for us to discuss these. The second angel pours out his bowl on the sea. And the sea becomes like blood, and every living thing in it died. Now the second trumpet also involved the sea turning to blood. But there, it was 1/3. Only 1/3 of the sea became blood. And only 1/3 of the living things died. But here, the disaster is total. Right? The entire sea becomes blood. Every living thing died. Now think about it this way. Because of where Rome was in Italy, land trade was rather limited. And so most of the trade was done by sea. So think now, right? These plagues are attacking those that worship the beast, those that have the mark of the beast. And you can only buy or sell if you have the mark of the beast. And now God is judging, God is enacting judgments on the sea, the very thing that makes it possible for the beast to buy and sell. Right? And so you've made this situation, and now you're going to reap the consequences economically of your position. The sea is struck. The third bowl of wrath strikes fresh water with the same thing. It becomes blood as well. Both of these, of course, reminiscent of the first plague of Exodus, the turning of the Nile and the waters of Egypt into blood, although this time much more expansive than what is suggested in Egypt. But here, too, there's a parallel with the trumpets, because I believe it was the third trumpet brought down the star wormwood, who poisoned the fresh waters, right? And so now the fresh waters are being poisoned as well, but this time by turning them into blood.